The first thing you notice about Murphy's isn't the peeling paint on the door or the neon sign that flickers between open and ope. It's the way the light falls through the windows at exactly 6:30 every evening, cutting amber slices through the dim interior like butter through warm bread. The second thing you notice is how quiet it is for a bar in the middle of downtown. Not library quiet, but the kind of quiet that wraps around conversations and makes them feel more important than they probably are. I discovered Murphy's 3 months after moving to the city, when the novelty of my new job had worn thin and the apartment I was paying too much for still felt like someone else's life. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because Tuesdays have always felt like the loneliest day of the week. Not dramatic like Monday, not hopeful like Wednesday, just existing. I'd walked past Murphy's dozens of times on my way home from the office, but that particular Tuesday, something about the warm glow seeping from its windows made me stop. The door opened with a soft chime, and I stepped into what felt like stepping back in time. Dark wood everywhere, the kind that's been polished by thousands of elbows and forearms over decades. Mismatched chairs around small tables, most of them empty at this early hour. A jukebox in the corner that looked like it might actually still work. And behind the bar, wiping down glasses with methodical precision, was him. I didn't know his name then. Didn't know that he preferred his coffee black and his books dog-eared, or that he had a scar above his left eyebrow from falling off his bike when he was 8. All I knew is that when he looked up and caught my eyes, something in my chest did a small, unexpected flip. "What can I get you?" he asked, and his voice had the same quality as the bar itself, warm, unhurried, like there was nowhere else in the world he needed to be. I ordered a whiskey neat, something I'd never done before, but felt right in that moment, in that place. He poured it without flourish, set it down on a coaster that had seen better days, and went back to his glasses. But I caught him glancing over once or twice, and when I left an hour later, slightly buzzed and significantly calmer than I'd been all week, he called out, "See you around." I went back the next week. Same day, same time, slipping through the door just as the 6:30 light was doing its magic trick with the windows. This time, there were a few more people scattered throughout the bar. A woman reading a paperback in the corner booth, two men having what looked like a serious conversation over beer and pretzels, an older gentleman working on a crossword puzzle. But my stool at the end of the bar was empty, waiting. The bartender, I still didn't know his name, looked up when the door chimed, and I could swear I saw something that might have been recognition flicker across his face. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. Either way, I made my way over, claimed the same stool I'd occupied the week before, and waited. "Whiskey neat?" I nodded, trying not to seem too pleased that he'd remembered. He poured, set the glass down on the same spot, and this time, instead of returning immediately to his glass wiping, he lingered. "How was your week?" he asked, leaning one elbow on the bar. It was such a simple question, the kind strangers ask when they're being polite, but the way he asked it, like he actually wanted to know, caught me off guard. I told him about my job at the marketing firm, about the client who couldn't make up his mind about color schemes, about my upstairs neighbor's inexplicable fondness for practicing violin at midnight. He listened, nodding at the right moments, asking follow-up questions that proved he was actually paying attention. When I finished my drink and prepared to leave, he said, "I'm Michael, by the way." "David," I replied, and when he smiled, I realized I'd been hoping to see that smile again all week. The third week, he had my drink ready before I'd even fully settled onto the stool. "Bad day?" Michael asked, apparently reading something in my posture that I hadn't realized I was broadcasting. I had been a bad day, actually. The kind where nothing goes catastrophically wrong, but nothing goes particularly right either, and by 5 o'clock you feel like you've been slowly deflating since morning. I told him about it. The presentation that fell flat, the lunch that got cold while I was stuck on a conference call, the way my boss had this habit of saying perfect when he meant the exact opposite. Michael listened, drying the same glass 3 times while I talked. When I finished, he leaned back against the bar's rear counter and said, "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're better at reading people than you realize. That boss of yours, the way you describe him, it sounds like he's threatened by something. Maybe by the fact that you actually care about doing good work." It wasn't earth-shattering wisdom, but it was perspective I hadn't considered, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that made me want to hear more of his thoughts on everything. We talked for another 20 minutes before other customers required his attention. But even as he moved down the bar, taking orders and making drinks, I caught him glancing back in my direction. By the fourth week, it had become routine. Tuesday evenings at Murphy's, my drink waiting, conversation flowing as naturally as the whiskey down my throat. I learned that Michael had been working at Murphy's for 2 years, that he was saving money for graduate school, that he'd grown up in a small town outside the city where everyone knew everyone else's business. He learned that I was from the suburbs, that I'd majored in English, but somehow ended up in marketing, that I had strong opinions about coffee shops that played music too loud. You strike me as someone who reads, he said one evening apropos of nothing. We'd been talking about movies, and somehow the conversation had meandered toward the difference between books and their film adaptations. Is it that obvious? You get this look when you're thinking like you're comparing what you're hearing to something you've already read. It's. He paused, seeming to search for the right word. It's endearing. Heat crept up my neck, and I took a longer sip of whiskey than necessary. I go through phases. Right now, I'm working my way through mysteries. Nothing too literary, just stories that make sense, where there's a puzzle and someone solves it. Like life, but with clear answers. Exactly. I was surprised by how well he understood what I meant. What about you? What do you read? Biographies, mostly. I like reading about people who figured out how to become themselves, how to turn into the person they were meant to be. It was such an unexpectedly profound thing to say that I didn't have an immediate response. Instead, I found myself studying his face, the concentration in his eyes, the way his mouth curved slightly downward when he was thinking seriously about something. He had good hands, I noticed. Long fingers, calloused in places that suggested he did more than just pour drinks. What? He asked, apparently noticing my scrutiny. Nothing, just. That's an interesting way to think about reading. He shrugged, suddenly looking almost shy. I probably overthink things. No, I said quickly. No, I don't think you do. Something passed between us then, a moment of recognition that felt larger than the words we'd spoken. Michael's eyes held mine for a beat longer than conversation usually required, and I wondered if he felt it too. This pull, this sense of standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite name. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of 3 college-aged kids who ordered complicated cocktails and paid in crumpled bills. Michael moved away to serve them, but before he did, he touched my wrist briefly, just fingertips against skin. So quick it might have been accidental. It wasn't accidental, I was sure of it. The 5th Tuesday it rained. Not the gentle, romantic kind of rain from movies, but the aggressive, soaking kind that makes you question all your life choices that led to you being outside in it. I arrived at Murphy's drenched and slightly breathless, having half jogged the last 2 blocks. Michael looked up from whatever he was reading behind the bar, a thick paperback with a worn cover, and broke into a grin. Rough commute? You could say that. I ran a hand through my damp hair and claimed my usual stool. The bar was busier tonight, maybe because of the weather driving people indoors, but somehow my spot had remained empty. My drink appeared without my asking, along with a bar towel that Michael slid across the wooden surface. For your hair, he explained. You look like a wet dog, a handsome wet dog, he added quickly, and then looked slightly surprised by his own words. Thanks, I think. He laughed, a sound I'd begun looking forward to all week. Sorry, that came out wrong. You look fine. Good, you look good. There was something different about him tonight, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before, like he was working up the courage to say something. I dried my hair while he served other customers, hyper-aware of his movements behind the bar. When he returned, he was carrying his book. What are you reading? I asked. He held up the cover, a biography of Miles Davis. Research for my thesis proposal. I'm applying to music history programs. You want to study music? Jazz, specifically. The way it evolved, how it reflected social change, how art responds to the world around it. He opened to a page marked with a receipt and showed me a black and white photograph of Davis playing trumpet. Look at his face. You can see everything he's feeling, even in a still photograph. I studied the image, but mostly I found myself studying Michael's face as he talked about it. His eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before, and his hands gestured animatedly as he explained something about modal jazz and harmonic progressions. I didn't understand half of what he was saying, but I could have listened to him talk about it for hours. Sorry, he said eventually, seeming to catch himself. I get carried away talking about music. Most people's eyes glaze over. Mine didn't. No, he said, looking at me with something that might have been surprise. They didn't, did they? We were interrupted again. Murphy's seemed to have a talent for timing. But this time, when Michael moved away to serve other customers, I felt like we'd crossed some invisible line. He was sharing things with me now, real things. The kind of details you don't tell casual acquaintances. And I realized I wanted to tell him real things too. The 6th Tuesday, I brought a book. Not intentionally. I'd been reading on the subway and forgot to put it away before walking into Murphy's. But when Michael noticed it tucked under my arm, his face brightened. What's this week's mystery? I held up the paperback copy of The Big Sleep. Going back to the classics, figured I should read Chandler properly. Philip Marlowe. Good choice. Michael started making my drink without being asked. Though I always thought Marlowe was too cynical, like he expected the worst from everyone. Maybe that's why he was good at his job. No one could disappoint him. But what kind of way is that to live? Michael set down my whiskey and leaned forward, elbows on the bar. Always assuming people will let you down? It was such an earnest question that I found myself giving it serious thought. I don't know. Maybe it's protective. If you don't expect much, you can't be hurt when people don't deliver. Or maybe you miss out on all the times people surprise you, all the times they're better than you expected. There was something in the way he said it, in the way his eyes stayed fixed on mine, that made me wonder if we were still talking about Philip Marlowe. The bar was quieter tonight, just a handful of regulars scattered throughout, the kind of crowd that minded its own business. It felt more intimate somehow, like Michael and I were sharing secrets rather than just conversation. What about you? I asked. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? He paused, thinking. I'm hopeful. There's a difference. Optimism is thinking everything will work out. Hope is knowing it might not, but choosing to believe in the possibility anyway. I took a sip of my whiskey, letting his words settle. That's a good distinction. My mom used to say that. She died when I was 15, and for a while I was angry at the world. Angry at her for leaving, angry at everyone who still had their parents, angry at hope itself. But eventually I realized that being hopeful wasn't about guaranteeing a happy ending. It was about staying open to one. The revelation hung between us, heavy and trust-filled. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound trite, so I did something that felt more honest than words. I reached across the bar and briefly covered his hand with mine. Thank you for telling me that. He turned his palm up, and for just a moment, our fingers intertwined. His skin was warm and slightly rough from years of handling glassware, and I could feel the callus on his index finger that I'd noticed before. Then someone called his name from the other end of the bar, and the moment broke. But the feeling lingered. Even after he moved away, even after I finished my drink and prepared to leave, I could still feel the phantom pressure of his fingers against mine. Same time next week? He asked as I put on my jacket. Wouldn't miss it. He smiled, and this time, I was certain there was something different in it. Something that made my heart do that small flip again, stronger this time. By the 7th week, I'd begun to look forward to Tuesday all week long. Not just the end of the workday, not just the comfort of routine, but specifically the prospect of seeing Michael, of settling onto my stool and having him already know what I wanted, of talking about books and music, and the small observations that seemed significant in the amber light of Murphy's. I'd started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way he hummed under his breath while he worked, usually jazz standards I'd begun to recognize. The way he remembered not just my drink, but how I liked it served, in which glass, with how much ice. The way his face changed when he laughed. How his whole expression softened and opened up. And I'd started noticing the way he looked at me. Quick glances when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded bar. The way conversations with me seemed to stretch longer than conversations with other customers. Even when the bar was busy and he should have been moving efficiently from person to person. You know, he said that Tuesday during one of those stretched conversations. I keep meaning to ask you something. I was midway through telling him about a book I just finished. Something about a detective in 1940s Los Angeles. But I stopped. What? What do you do when you're not here? I mean, besides work and reading, what does your life look like? It was such a simple question, but it made me realize how much of my life had begun to revolve around these Tuesday evenings. My weeks had developed a rhythm. Monday was recovery from the weekend. Tuesday was anticipation. Wednesday through Friday was counting down until the next Tuesday. Weekends were for errands and catching up on sleep and trying not to think about how much I was looking forward to seeing Michael again. Honestly, not much. I'm still figuring out how to live in a new city. Most of my college friends moved away after graduation, and I haven't really figured out how to make new friends as an adult. Michael nodded, understanding in a way that made me suspect he'd had similar experiences. It's harder than people pretend it is, making friends, building a life somewhere new. Everyone acts like it should be automatic. Exactly, like there's some secret manual everyone got except me. Well, he said, and there was something almost shy in his expression. If it helps, I consider you a friend. The word hit me with unexpected force. Friend. It should have been enough. Was more than I'd had any right to expect when I'd first walked through Murphy's door. But hearing him say it, I realized it wasn't quite what I wanted. Or maybe it was exactly what I wanted, but not all I wanted. I consider you a friend too, I said, because it was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. We were interrupted by the usual parade of customers, but throughout the evening, I found myself turning that word over in my mind. Friend. The way Michael had said it, like it meant something. Like it was important to him that I knew where I stood in his life. But there were other moments that felt like more than friendship. The way he'd touch my arm when he was emphasizing a point. The way he'd lean closer when the bar got loud. His voice dropping to something that felt almost intimate. The way he'd sometimes forget what he was doing mid-sentence and just look at me, as if he was trying to memorize my face. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe friendship was all it was, and I was reading too much into small gestures and lingering glances. Maybe the warmth I felt when he smiled at me was entirely one-sided. But when I left that night, he called out, "Hey, David." I turned back. "I'm glad you wandered in here. That first night, I'm glad you kept coming back." "Me too," I said, and meant it more than he could possibly know. The 8th Tuesday changed everything. I arrived later than usual, detained by a client call that ran over, and found Murphy's busier than I'd ever seen it. Every table was occupied, and the bar was lined with people too deep in places. Through the crowd, I could see Michael moving with efficient grace, taking orders and making drinks. But even from the doorway, I could tell he was overwhelmed. I considered leaving. My usual stool was occupied by a woman in a business suit who looked like she'd had a day even worse than mine, and there didn't seem to be room for another body in the already crowded space. But as I walked toward Murphy's that Tuesday evening, I realized I needed to know. Whatever this was between us, it was too important to abandon out of fear. On part 2, the door chimed as I entered Murphy's, and I felt the familiar wash of amber light and quiet music. But tonight, something was different. Michael looked up from behind the bar, and when our eyes met, his entire face transformed with relief and something that looked like joy. "You came," he said, as if there had been any real question. "Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would, but I wasn't sure if things might be different now." I made my way to my usual stool, noting that despite it being a typically busy Tuesday, somehow my spot remained empty. "Are they different?" Michael was already reaching for the whiskey bottle, the movement automatic after all these weeks. But his hands were less steady than usual, and I could see a faint flush creeping up his neck. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Are they?" I watched him pour my drink with the same careful precision he'd shown from the very first night. Except now I understood that precision differently. It wasn't just professional competence, it was care, attention, the physical manifestation of the way he'd been seeing me all along. "They're different," I said quietly, but not in a bad way. Michael set the glass down in front of me, and our fingers brushed as I reached for it. The touch was electric, more charged now that we'd acknowledged what was happening between us. Neither of us pulled away immediately. "Good different?" he asked. "Very good different." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, warm and bright and full of possibility. For a moment, we just looked at each other, grinning like idiots until someone at the other end of the bar called for service. As the evening progressed, I became acutely aware of how our dynamic had shifted. The easy conversation was still there, but underneath it ran a current of awareness that hadn't existed before, or that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. Every glance lingered a little longer. Every casual touch carried weight. When Michael laughed at something I said, I found myself memorizing the sound. But more than that, I started noticing details I'd overlooked in previous weeks. The way Michael's attention always seemed to circle back to me, even when the bar was busy. The way he'd position himself so he could see me while he worked. The way he'd unconsciously mirror my posture. If I leaned forward, he'd find reasons to lean closer too. "You're observing tonight," Michael said during a brief lull, refilling my glass without being asked. "Is that obvious?" "To me, maybe. You get this look when you're really paying attention to something, like you're filing it away for later." The fact that he'd noticed my expressions well enough to categorize them sent warmth spreading through my chest. "What else do you notice?" Michael glanced around the bar, then leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You want the full list? Try me. You fidget with napkins when you're thinking hard about something. You always sit with your left ankle hooked behind the right leg of the stool. You hum along to Coltrane, but not to Miles Davis. I think because Coltrane's melodies are more intuitive, easier to follow." He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. "You stay later on nights when you've had a particularly bad day at work, like you're trying to balance it out with something good. And you always look back once when you leave, just before you reach the door." I stared at him, stunned by the catalog of small observations. These weren't just the casual noticings of a friendly bartender. They were the detailed attentions of someone who'd been studying me, learning me, caring enough to remember the smallest details of my presence. You notice all that? I notice everything about you, Michael said simply, and the honesty in his voice made my breath catch. Before I could respond, a group of college students burst through the door, loud and already half drunk, demanding Michael's attention. But as he moved away to serve them, his words echoed in my mind. I notice everything about you. It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, made more powerful by its simplicity and obvious truth. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of stolen glances and meaningful silences. Every time Michael returned to my section of the bar, the space between us seemed to contract a little more. I found myself leaning forward when he spoke, drawn by the quiet intensity in his voice. He seemed to be doing the same, finding excuses to stay closer than strictly necessary for conversation. By 10 o'clock, the bar had mostly emptied except for a few regulars nursing final drinks. Michael finished serving the last customer and returned to where I sat. But instead of standing behind the bar as usual, he walked around to the customer side and slid onto the stool next to mine. The shift was small but significant. For the first time in all our weeks of conversation, we were on the same side of the bar, sitting next to each other like equals rather than customer and server. The invisible boundary that had always existed between us had been crossed, and I could feel the weight of that transgression in the way my pulse quickened. This feels different, I said. Good different or bad different? Terrifying different. Michael laughed softly. Yeah, I know what you mean. He was close enough now that I could smell his cologne, could see the 5 o'clock shadow. He hadn't had time to shave before work. Can I ask you something? Always. Why do you always come here? The question was quiet, serious, and I could tell it was something he'd been wanting to ask for a while. I mean, really, Murphy's isn't exactly the most exciting place in the city. The drinks are good, but not exceptional. The atmosphere is nice, but there are dozens of places like this. So why here? Why every Tuesday for how long has it been now? 10 weeks, I said without having to think about it. 10 weeks, so why? It was the question I'd been hoping he wouldn't ask, because answering it honestly meant admitting things I'd barely admitted to myself. But sitting here next to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, I realized that honesty was the only option. At first, it really was just the atmosphere, the quiet, the comfort of routine. After a long day, it felt like stepping into somewhere separate from the rest of my life. I paused, trying to find the right words. But after a few weeks, I realized I wasn't coming here for the whiskey, or the atmosphere, or the routine. What were you coming for? I turned to look at him directly, taking in the serious expression in his brown eyes. The way he was holding perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might break the spell of honesty we'd cast around ourselves. You, I said simply. I was coming here for you, because talking to you became the best part of my week. Because you listen like my words actually matter, because you remember things about books I've mentioned and ask follow-up questions about my terrible days at work. Because you make me feel like I'm interesting, like I'm worth knowing. Michael's expression softened, became something vulnerable and wondering. David, I know it's probably not professional for you to... Forget professional, he interrupted. This stopped being about professional boundaries weeks ago. The admission hung between us, loaded with implications. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of truth settling around us like a blanket. The bar felt even quieter now, more intimate, like the rest of the world had faded away and left us alone in this small pool of amber light. For me too, Michael said eventually. In case you were wondering, you became the reason I started looking forward to Tuesday shifts. The reason I started paying attention to what music was playing, because I wanted to know what you'd respond to. The reason I started reading more, because I wanted to be able to keep up with your book recommendations. You started reading more because of me. I started doing a lot of things because of you. Paying attention to jazz in new ways because I wanted to share it with someone who'd actually listen. Thinking about what stories might interest you. Wondering what you do on the other 6 days of the week when you're not here. The confession was so much more than I'd expected that I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the bar between us. His skin was warm and slightly rough from years of handling glassware, and when he turned his palm up to meet mine, I felt something settle into place inside my chest. This is happening, isn't it? I said. Yeah, Michael said, looking down at our joined hands with something like wonder. I think it is. We sat like that for a while, hands connected, processing the shift that had just occurred between us. Around us, Murphy's continued its quiet evening rhythm. Soft jazz from the speakers, the gentle clink of glasses as Michael's coworker cleaned up, the comfortable sounds of a place settling into closure. But none of it felt relevant to where we were sitting, to this bubble of intimate understanding we'd created. I should probably help close up, Michael said eventually, though he didn't move to let go of my hand. You should, but I don't want to. Then don't, not yet. He smiled, and I realized this was what contentment felt like. Not the dramatic passion of infatuation, but this quiet sense of rightness, of being exactly where I belonged with exactly the right person. Tell me something, Michael said. Something I don't know about you yet. I thought about it, trying to find something that felt equal to the weight of what we'd just shared. I used to write, I said eventually, when in college I thought I might be a writer. I had all these grand plans about novels and literary magazines and changing the world with words. What happened? Reality, I guess. Graduation, job hunting, student loans. It became easier to take the marketing position than to keep chasing something that felt so uncertain. I paused. I still write sometimes, just for myself, but I haven't shown anyone anything in years. What kind of writing? Stories, mostly, about people finding connection in unexpected places, about the small moments that end up changing everything, about— I gestured around us. About things like this, I suppose. Michael's thumb traced gentle circles on my knuckles. I'd love to read something you've written. Someday, when you're ready. The offer was casual, but it hit me with unexpected force. The idea of sharing my writing with Michael, of letting him see that part of myself I'd kept carefully hidden, felt both terrifying and thrilling. Maybe someday, I said. What about you? Tell me something I don't know. Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. I used to be married, he said eventually. The revelation was so unexpected that I felt my hand tense in his. Married? For about 2 years, right after college. Her name was Sarah. She was lovely and kind and everything I thought I was supposed to want. He looked down at our joined hands. But I spent the entire marriage feeling like I was playing a role, like I was trying to be someone I wasn't. We divorced amicably about 3 years ago. Because you figured out you were gay? Because I figured out I was trying to force myself into a life that didn't fit. The gay part took a little longer to fully accept. He looked up at me with something that might have been anxiety. Does that bother you, that I was married to a woman? No, I said, and realized I meant it. It bothers me that you spent years trying to be someone you weren't. But the fact that you figured it out, that you chose authenticity over convenience, that doesn't bother me at all. Relief flickered across Michael's face. Good, I was worried it might change how you saw me. It doesn't change anything important. If anything, it makes me understand you better. The way you talk about hope, about becoming who you're meant to be, that makes more sense now. 3 years, Michael said quietly. 3 years of trying to figure out who I actually am instead of who I thought I should be. And then you walked into my bar and made me remember what it felt like to want something real. The word sent warmth flooding through me, but also a flutter of nervousness. That's a lot of pressure. I don't mean to put pressure on you. I just mean this feels different from anything I've experienced before. More honest, somehow. It does feel honest, I agreed. Scary, but honest. Michael's coworker appeared at the far end of the bar. Michael, we're all set back here. You good to finish up? Yeah, thanks, Jake. See you Thursday. Jake gathered his things and left through the back exit, leaving us alone in the bar. The quiet felt different now, more complete, like we were the only two people left in the world. I should probably let you close, I said, though I made no move to leave. You should, Michael agreed, also not moving. But first, he stood up from his stool and walked back around the bar. But instead of resuming his usual position behind it, he leaned across the wooden surface, bringing his face closer to mine than it had ever been before. Close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could feel his breath when he spoke. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice low and intimate. What? I've been thinking about kissing you for weeks, since that night you told me about your boss, when you got that look on your face like you were seeing something clearly for the first time. I watched you think through what I'd said, and I wanted to lean across this bar and kiss you right then. The confession sent heat racing through my veins. Why didn't you? Because I wasn't sure if you wanted me to. Because I was afraid of ruining whatever this was between us. Because— He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Because I've never felt this way about a customer before. I've never felt this way about anyone before. My heart was beating so hard, I was sure he could hear it. Michael, I know we're in a complicated situation. I know there are professional boundaries and ethical considerations and all sorts of reasons why this might be a bad idea. But David— He reached across the bar and cradled my face in his hands. I don't want to pretend anymore that this is just friendly conversation. I don't want to pretend that I don't look forward to Tuesday nights because it means I get to see you. I don't want to pretend that this thing between us isn't the most real thing in my life right now. Instead of responding with words, I leaned into his touch, closing the remaining distance between us. When our lips met, it was soft and tentative at first, both of us still half afraid of crossing this final line. But when I felt him smile against my mouth, I relaxed into the kiss, letting it deepen and become something warm and promising and right. When we finally broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching across the bar. Wow, I breathed. Yeah, Michael said, his voice slightly unsteady. Wow. We stayed like that for a moment, breathing each other's air, processing what had just happened. The kiss had been everything I'd imagined and more. Tender but charged with possibility, familiar somehow despite being entirely new. I should really close up now, Michael said eventually. Right, of course. But neither of us moved. Instead, we stayed frozen in that moment of intimacy, reluctant to break the spell by returning to the practical world of locking up and turning off lights and going our separate ways. David? Yeah? Would you would you mind waiting while I close? I know it's late, but I don't want this night to end yet. I don't mind waiting. Michael's smile was brilliant. He began the familiar routine of closing the bar, counting the register, washing glasses, turning off the music. But everything felt different now, charged with the awareness of what had just passed between us. I watched him work, no longer trying to hide my attention, openly admiring the efficient grace with which he moved through familiar tasks. You know, he said as he wiped down the bar surface, I lied about something earlier. What? When I said I'd been thinking about kissing you since that night a few weeks ago, it was actually longer than that. It was probably the third or fourth time you came in when you told me about that book you'd been reading and got so animated talking about the detective's methods. You had this light in your eyes, and you used your hands while you talked, and I thought, he paused in his wiping to look at me. I thought you were the most attractive person I'd ever seen. Heat crept up my neck. The third time? Maybe the second. Definitely by the fourth. Michael grinned, seeming younger and less careful than I'd ever seen him. I've been completely gone for you for weeks, David. I just wasn't sure if it was appropriate to say anything. What changed your mind? Tonight. The way you looked at me when you walked in, like you were as relieved to see me as I was to see you. The way you answered when I asked why you keep coming here. The way you didn't pull away when I touched your hand. He finished wiping the bar and tossed the towel into a hamper beneath the counter. It stopped feeling like something I could ignore. Michael moved through the rest of his closing routine with practiced efficiency, but I could sense an undercurrent of nervous energy, as if he were working up the courage to say something else. When he finally finished and grabbed his jacket from behind the bar, he hesitated. David? Yes? Would you would you like me to walk you home or to your car or wherever you're headed? The offer was casual, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. He was asking for more time together, for a chance to extend this evening beyond the confines of Murphy's, but he was also leaving me room to decline if the intimacy was becoming too much. I'd like that, I said. I walked tonight, so home is good. Michael's smile was relieved and happy. We made our way to the door together, and he paused to lock up behind us. The street was quiet at this hour, just the occasional car passing by and the distant hum of the city that never quite sleeps. The cool night air was a shock after the warmth of the bar, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. Which way? Michael asked. I pointed toward my neighborhood, and we began walking. For the first few blocks, we maintained the careful distance of two people still learning how to be around each other in this new context. But gradually, as we talked about inconsequential things, the weather, the late hour, the way the city looked different at night, we drifted closer together. By the time we'd walked 6 blocks, our hands were brushing with each step. By the 8th block, Michael's fingers had found mine, tentative at first, and then with growing confidence. By the 10th block, we were walking hand in hand down the quiet street like it was the most natural thing in the world. This is nice, I said. Yeah, it is. Michael squeezed my hand gently. Different from the bar. Good different? Very good different. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, and I found myself marveling at how right this felt. The weight of his hand in mine, the rhythm of our steps matching automatically, the way we unconsciously adjusted our pace to stay perfectly in sync. It felt like something we'd been doing for years rather than something that had started 20 minutes ago. Can I ask you something? Michael said as we turned onto my street. Of course. What happens now? I mean, after tonight? Do we pretend this didn't happen when you come in next Tuesday? Do we try to go back to the way things were before? It was a fair question when I'd been wondering about myself. The practical complications were real. Michael worked at Murphy's, and I was a regular customer. There were professional boundaries to consider, workplace policies that might be relevant, the potential awkwardness if things didn't work out between us. But as I considered those complications, I realized they felt secondary to something more important. I didn't want to go back to the way things were before. I didn't want to pretend this hadn't happened. Didn't want to reduce what we'd discovered tonight to something that could be contained within the boundaries of Tuesday evening conversations. I don't want to pretend, I said. Do you? No, Michael said immediately. God, no, but I also don't want to make things weird for you at Murphy's. I don't want you to feel like you can't come in anymore because of what happened between us. We'd reached my building and we stopped on the sidewalk outside. Michael turned to face me, and in the light from the street lamps, I could see the genuine concern in his expression. Murphy's is your territory, I said. If anyone should be worried about making things weird, it's me. It's not just my territory anymore, Michael said quietly. It's ours. Has been for weeks, actually. I just didn't realize it until tonight. The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through me. Ours. The word carried implications that felt both thrilling and terrifying. So what do we do? I asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. I think we figure it out as we go. I think we try to be honest with each other about what we want and what makes us comfortable, and then I think, he paused, seeming to gather his courage. I think we see what happens when we stop limiting this to Tuesday nights. What do you mean? Michael stepped closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to maintain eye contact. I mean, maybe we could try spending time together outside of Murphy's. Maybe we could go to dinner or see a movie or just walk around the city and talk like we do at the bar. Maybe we could find out what this looks like when it's not defined by professional boundaries and customer relationships. My heart was racing again, but this time it felt like excitement rather than nervousness. You want to date me? I want to date you, Michael confirmed. If you want to date me too. Instead of answering immediately, I reached up and cupped his face in my hands, feeling the slight roughness of his stubble against my palms. Yes, I said simply. I want to date you too. Michael's smile was radiant. Good, he said. And then he was kissing me again. More confidently this time, with the assurance of someone who knew the kiss would be welcomed. I could taste the lingering hint of coffee on his lips, could feel the solid warmth of his body pressed against mine, and for a moment the entire world narrowed down to just this, the two of us on a quiet street, discovering what we could become together. When we broke apart, we stayed close, reluctant to end the contact. I should probably go up, I said, though I didn't want to. You shouldn't, Michael agreed, also not moving. But I don't want to. I know, I don't want you to either. He brushed a strand of hair back from my forehead. The gesture so tender, it made my chest ache. But this isn't going anywhere. We don't have to rush anything. Promise? Promise. Michael pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. Besides, I still owe you dinner. Can't have our first real date be on the sidewalk outside your apartment. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had all evening. When? When are you free? Tomorrow, I said, then immediately felt my face heat with embarrassment. Sorry, that sounds too eager. It sounds perfect, Michael said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Tomorrow it is. We made plans to meet at 7, exchanging phone numbers and addresses with the kind of giddy excitement that reminded me of being 16 and planning my first real date. When we'd covered all the practical details, we stood looking at each other again, neither wanting to be the first to leave. I should really go, I said finally. You should. This was... Yeah, Michael said, understanding without needing specifics. It really was. I turned toward my building, then looked back. Michael was still standing where I'd left him, watching me with an expression of soft wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened either. Michael? Yeah? I probably shouldn't say this, but I don't want this to stay just behind the bar. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Good, he said, because neither do I. I went inside and climbed the stairs to my apartment, feeling like I was floating rather than walking. Behind me, through the window in the stairwell, I could see Michael still standing on the sidewalk, and when he saw me in the window, he raised one hand in a small wave before turning to walk back toward his own home. In my apartment, I poured myself a glass of water and sat on my couch, trying to process everything that had happened. The conversation, the confession, the kiss, the promise of tomorrow. It felt too good to be real, too perfectly aligned with what I'd been hoping for without quite allowing myself to hope for it. My phone buzzed with a text message. Michael, thank you for tonight, for being honest, for being brave, for walking home with me. I can't wait for tomorrow. I typed back, Ma, thank you for noticing my usual and everything else. His response came quickly, always. I fell asleep that night with my phone on the pillow beside me, Michael's final text still glowing on the screen. Always. It felt like a promise, like the beginning of something I had been waiting for my entire adult life, without quite knowing what I was waiting for. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Hesitated, Michael looked up from the drink he was preparing and caught sight of me near the door. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and his face broke into a smile, so bright and relieved that it took my breath away. He said something to the bartender working beside him. I hadn't realized Murphy's had more than one bartender, and then he was weaving through the crowd toward me. "Thank God you're here," he said when he reached me, slightly breathless. "I was starting to think you weren't coming. Client emergency, you're swamped tonight. Tuesday night trivia, I forgot to warn you. It only happens once a month, but when it does," he gestured at the chaos around us. "Your stool's taken, but there's a table in the back corner that just opened up, if you don't mind sitting there instead." I minded it, actually. Sitting at a table would change the dynamic entirely. No leaning across the bar, no easy conversation while he worked. But the alternative was leaving, and the thought of not seeing Michael tonight felt worse than adapting to a different setup. "Sure," I said. He led me through the crowd to a small two-person table in the back corner, the kind of spot that would normally be dim and private, but tonight felt like a refuge from the chaos. "I'll bring your drink," he said, "and I'll try to come by when I can, but it's fine. So you're working, I understand." He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture that was probably meant to be friendly but sent electricity down my arm, and disappeared back into the crowd. I settled into my chair and tried to read, but found myself distracted by the sounds of the trivia game and the sight of Michael behind the bar. He was in his element tonight, I realized. Even overwhelmed, he moved with confidence and ease, chatting with customers, making drinks that looked effortless, somehow managing to be everywhere at once. I'd been seeing him in the quiet moments, during the slow hours when we could talk uninterrupted. But watching him work a busy crowd showed me a different side of him. Competent, charismatic, completely in command of his environment. It was attractive in a way that caught me off guard. I'd been drawn to his thoughtfulness, his quiet intelligence, the way he listened like my words actually mattered. But seeing him like this, seeing the easy confidence with which he handled chaos, added another layer to my growing fascination. He managed to break away twice during the evening, bringing my refill and sitting across from me for a few stolen minutes each time. The second time, he looked exhausted but happy. "How are the trivia questions?" I asked. "Brutal. Third round is always music, and they're doing deep cuts tonight. Someone just asked about a B-side from a 1967 Charlie Parker recording. Did anyone get it? Jim at the bar. He's got an encyclopedic knowledge of jazz. Sometimes I think he knows more than I do." Michael glanced around the crowded room, then back at me. "This isn't exactly how I pictured tonight going." "What did you picture?" "The usual quiet conversation, you telling me about whatever you're reading, me probably talking too much about whatever biography I'm working through." He paused. "I look forward to it. To Tuesday nights, I mean, more than I should, probably." The admission hung between us. Loaded with implications, neither of us seemed ready to name directly. I wanted to tell him that I looked forward to Tuesday nights too, that they'd become the best part of my week, that I'd started planning my schedule around ensuring I'd never miss one. Instead, I said, "They're the best part of my week." Michael's smile was soft and surprised, like he hadn't expected me to be so direct. "Really?" "Really." We looked at each other across the small table, the noise of the trivia game fading into background. For a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the room, like the crowded bar had disappeared around us. Then someone called Michael's name from behind the bar, and reality reasserted itself. "I should get back," he said, but he didn't move immediately. "Go, I'll be here." When he stood, he hesitated and then leaned on down and kissed the top of my head. It was quick, probably looked casual to anyone watching, but it sent shockwaves through my entire body. By the time I'd recovered enough to look up, he was already threading his way back through the crowd. I sat in that corner table for another hour, nursing my drink and pretending to read, while actually replaying that brief kiss over and over. It had felt like a promise, like the beginning of something I'd been hoping for without quite allowing myself to name it. When the trivia game finally ended and the crowd began to thin, I moved back to my usual stool. Michael appeared in front of me almost immediately, looking relieved to see me still there. "Thought you might have given up on me." "Not a chance." He started cleaning glasses, a familiar rhythm that felt comforting after the chaos of the evening. "Sorry about tonight. This isn't usually how things go." "It was fine. Interesting to see you in action during the busy times." "And what was the verdict?" "Impressive. You're good at this." He looked pleased by the assessment. "It pays the bills while I figure out my next move, but it's not—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It's not what I want to be doing forever. Does that make sense?" "Completely. I feel the same way about my job. It's fine, it's stable, but it's not what I imagined myself doing when I was 22 and thought I was going to change the world. What did you imagine? Writing, maybe, or teaching something that felt more meaningful? I took a sip of my drink. What about you? Besides the music history program, what's the dream? Teaching, actually. College level, maybe someday professor. I want to study how jazz influenced social change, how music became a form of resistance and expression for communities that didn't have other voices. And then I want to teach that to people who think music is just entertainment. The passion in his voice was unmistakable, and I found myself leaning forward, drawn in by his enthusiasm. That sounds incredible. It's a long road. Graduate school, probably a PhD, years of research and writing. And there's no guarantee I'll actually get hired anywhere. He shrugged. But like I said before, I'm hopeful. You'll do it, I said with more certainty than I'd expected to feel. You'll get into a program and you'll research whatever you want to research, and you'll become the professor who changes how students think about music. Michael stopped mid-wipe of the glass he was holding and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You really believe that? I do. Why? It was such a simple question, but answering it honestly meant acknowledging things I'd been trying not to think about too directly. Why did I believe in him? Because of the way he talked about music with such reverence and knowledge. Because of the way he listened to people, really listened, like their words mattered. Because of the way he'd somehow made me feel like I mattered week after week without ever making it seem like work. Because, I said finally, you care about things, really care. And you pay attention to people in a way that most people don't. Those are the qualities that make good teachers and good people. Something shifted in Michael's expression, became softer and more vulnerable. He set down the glass he'd been holding and leaned forward, elbows on the bar, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. David, he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth than it ever had before. Lower, more intimate, like he was testing how it felt to say it that way. Yeah? I need to tell you something. My heart started beating faster. What? He glanced around the bar, which had mostly emptied except for a few die-hard regulars and the other bartender cleaning up in the far corner. When he looked back at me, there was something nervous and determined in his expression. I don't usually remember anyone's usual, he said quietly. I'm good at my job, don't get me wrong, but I serve probably 100 people a week, and most of them blur together. But from that very first night you came in, I remembered exactly what you ordered. Remembered how you looked when you said it, how you sat on that stool, which direction you faced while you drank it. I felt like the air had gone thin, like I was suddenly at a much higher altitude. Michael, and it's not just the drink order. I remember everything about you. The way you run your hand through your hair when you're thinking. The way your face changes when you talk about a book you really loved. The way you laugh when something actually strikes you as funny, not just when you're being polite. He paused, taking a deep breath. I remember these things because I want to remember them, because every Tuesday, from about noon on, I start watching the door waiting for you to walk through it. The confession hung between us, honest and vulnerable, and terrifying. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel heat climbing up my neck and spreading across my face. I need to tell you something too, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I don't come here for the whiskey. I come here for you. I spend all week looking forward to Tuesday night because it means I get to see you again. And I've been trying not to think about what that means because I didn't want to ruin whatever this is between us, but I think I'm past the point of pretending it's just friendship. Michael's eyes searched my face as if he was looking for some sign that I didn't mean what I'd just said. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because slowly, carefully, he reached across the bar and covered my hand with both of his. So what do we do now, he asked. It was a good question. We were in uncharted territory now, having acknowledged something that had been building for weeks but had never been spoken aloud. The weight of possibility hung between us, exciting and terrifying in equal measure. I don't know, I admitted. I've never done this before, not like this. Done what? Fallen for someone gradually. Usually it's immediate and obvious and probably doomed. This is different. This feels important. Michael's thumbs traced gentle circles on my knuckles, and the simple touch sent warmth all the way up my arms. It is important. At least it is to me. We sat like that for a long moment, hands connected across the bar, the weight of our admissions settling around us. The bar was nearly empty now, just soft jazz playing from the sound system and the gentle clink of glasses being washed. It felt like we were existing in our own private world, separate from everything else. I should probably close up soon, Michael said eventually, though he didn't let go of my hands. Yeah, I should probably head home. Neither of us moved. David? Michael's voice was soft, uncertain. Would you? Would you want to maybe grab dinner sometime? Outside of this place, I mean like a proper date. The word sent a thrill through me that I felt in my fingertips and toes. Date. He'd said it, made it official, turned whatever this was between us into something with a name. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that a lot. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Good, great. I was hoping, he laughed, suddenly seeming younger. I was hoping you'd say that. The other bartender appeared at Michael's shoulder, keys in hand. I'm heading out, he said. You good to finish up? Yeah, thanks, Danny. See you Thursday. Danny left through the back, and suddenly we were alone in the bar. The lighting seemed different somehow, more intimate, like the space had contracted around us. Michael reluctantly released my hands and began the process of closing up, counting the register, washing the last few glasses, turning off the music. I watched him work, memorizing the way he moved through the familiar routine. Everything felt different now, charged with new meaning. This wasn't just Michael, the bartender, closing up Murphy's. This was Michael, who remembered my drink order and waited for me to walk through the door every week, who wanted to take me on a date, who had just admitted to feeling the same pull I'd been fighting for months. Walk you out? He asked when he'd finished. We stepped into the cool night air together, and Michael locked the door behind us. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional car passing by. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, suddenly unsure of the protocol now that we were outside the familiar confines of the bar. So, I said. So, he agreed. This is new territory. Yeah, Michael smiled, looking as nervous as I felt. But good territory, I think. Definitely good territory. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Can I... He hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. Can I kiss you goodnight? Instead of answering, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, both of us unsure, but when I felt him smile against my lips, I relaxed into it. He tasted like coffee and possibility, and when we finally broke apart, I felt dizzy with want and promise. Wow, he breathed. Yeah, wow. We stood there, grinning at each other like teenagers, and I realized that this was what hope felt like. Not the abstract concept Michael had described weeks ago, but the real physical sensation of it, light and warm and alive in my chest. I should go, I said, though I made no move to leave. You should, he agreed, also not moving. But first, when? For dinner, I mean. Are you free Friday? I am now. Michael laughed. Good. I'll pick you up at 7 if you give me your address. We exchanged numbers and addresses, fingers brushing as we handed back phones, each touch electric with newness. When we finally said goodnight and headed in opposite directions, I found myself walking with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. At home, I poured myself a glass of water and sat on my couch, replaying the evening in my mind. The kiss, the confession, the way Michael had looked at me when I said it felt important, the way he'd said my name like it was something precious. I thought about the 9 weeks that had led us here, the gradual building of trust and affection, the way Tuesday nights had become the anchor of my week. I thought about how natural it had felt to reach across that bar and touch his hand, how right it had felt when he'd kissed the top of my head during the chaos of trivia night. This was what I'd been missing in all those immediate attractions, all those relationships that had burned bright and fast before flaming out. This slow building, this foundation of genuine friendship and respect and interest in each other as complete people. The sense that we were choosing each other with full knowledge of what we were choosing. My phone buzzed with a text message. Michael, thank you for tonight, for being honest, for being you. I can't wait for Friday. I typed back, thank you for remembering my usual, and for everything else. His response came quickly, always. I fell asleep that night thinking about possibility and jazz music and the way Michael's hands had felt covering mine. About the way he'd said, always, like it was a promise he intended to keep. Friday couldn't come fast enough. But first, there was one more Tuesday. I almost didn't go. The thought crossed my mind as I was getting ready to leave work. What if things felt different now? What if the easy companionship we'd built over 9 weeks had been disrupted by our admissions, by that kiss on the sidewalk, by the promise of dinner later in the week? But as I